How was I supposed to know my 7-year-old was hiding a knife under her pillow? After all, she still slept with a nightlight and asked me to check for monsters under her bed. Her name was Maple, and she was the youngest and softest of my 3 kids. But when the front door slammed at 3 a.m., she was sitting on the living room couch in the dark. My husband stumbled in drunk and saw her immediately. "Why are you up, sweetie? Do you want Daddy to come help you relax?" he slurred. Maple didn't answer. Her small hands were gripping her pajama pants. I woke up and rushed downstairs. "Maple, go to your room. Now." She ran past me and up the stairs through the kitchen. I heard her feet hit every step. My husband's eyes locked on mine. "You're turning my kids against me. Please, just go to bed," I whispered, already backing away. He grabbed my arm so hard I felt his fingers dig into the same bruise from last week. He threw me against the wall. My head cracked against the picture frame. Glass shattered, and a shard sliced my shoulder. "Don't tell me what to do!" he screamed in my face. His breath reeked of whiskey. This happened every few weeks when he drank. Last time, 3 weeks ago, he broke our 15-year-old son Patrick's ribs. 2 of them. Our 12-year-old Sophie had learned to stay in her closet during these nights. She'd hide behind the hanging clothes and put her hands over her ears. Last time I found her asleep sitting up, her legs numb from not moving. Maple was different, though. She usually slept through everything. I'd been grateful because she never saw or even knew what her father became when he drank. At least I thought she never knew. My husband stumbled into the kitchen. I followed, trying to keep myself between him and the hallway so he couldn't go upstairs to the kids. He ripped the cabinet doors open, took the plates out and smashed them against the walls, looking for his pills. "I threw them out," I heard myself say. "You need to get help." My words were interrupted by him grabbing my hair and yanking my head back hard. I heard my neck crack. Then he shoved me. The back of my head hit the wall hard. Pain shot through my spine and I felt myself fall to the floor. I honestly thought I was paralyzed. I could barely move my legs. He took one look at me, then the stairs, and started heading for the kids' rooms. My blood froze. I couldn't let him reach the kids. I crawled towards the knife drawer. My hand shook as I quietly pulled it open, reaching for the large kitchen knife to try defend us. The same knife I'd hidden just in case a few hours ago. My fingers searched the drawer, but the knife wasn't there. How was that possible? I felt the sharp pain in my back return, but I couldn't think about that. I crawled after my husband, tasting blood from my split lip. I saw him upstairs, kicking Patrick's door. Once, twice. The door held. Patrick had barricaded it with his desk. Instead of stopping, he moved to Sophie's room, ripped the door open. I heard her scream. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, he was dragging her out of her closet by her arm. "Dad, please. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." He threw her aside. She hit her dresser hard and crumpled to the floor, sobbing, holding her shoulder. I tried to crawl to her. He kicked me back. I fell into her arms and my vision blurred. My husband stood over me. Then he turned and stumbled down the hall, towards Maple's door. "No!" I choked out. "She's just a baby. Please don't." He'd never touched Maple before. She was his favorite, the only one he never hurt. But I guess tonight was different. He opened her door. I tried to crawl toward them, but my body wouldn't move fast enough. Maple was laying in her bed, full body hidden under her covers. Her nightlight cast the shadow against the wall. "Come here," he slurred. Maple curled up into a ball and backed against the wall. "I said, come here!" He took 3 steps toward her, towered over her. She was 7 and barely came up to his waist. Maple was shaking under her covers. She pulled them down and looked up, but her eyes weren't darting around. They were locked on him. He reached down for her. That's when Maple's hand shot under her pillow. She grabbed something from behind it, the kitchen knife, my missing knife. She gripped it with both hands and drove it upward into his thigh with everything she had. The blade went in deep with wet slicing sound. My husband screamed. He stumbled backward and grabbed at his leg. Blood poured between his fingers, soaking through his jeans. He fell against the doorframe. His legs gave out. He crashed to the floor, his face white with shock. Maple stood there, still holding the knife, blood on her hands. "You don't get to hurt us anymore," she whispered. I crawled to the doorway, my shoulder still bleeding, my back screaming. I saw my 7-year-old daughter holding the bloody knife. Then I looked at my husband. He was trying to pry the knife out of his leg, screaming, "I'm gonna effing kill you all now." I forced my body to move. My back felt like someone was twisting a knife in my spine, but I had to get to Sophie. I crawled across the hallway floor, leaving a trail of blood from my shoulder. Sophie was curled up against her dresser, sobbing and holding her right shoulder. I reached her and ran my hands over her arm, checking for breaks. She screamed when I touched it, but I could tell it wasn't broken, just badly bruised like the rest of us. The door to Patrick's room exploded open. His desk scraped across the floor as he shoved it aside. He ran into the hallway and stopped dead when he saw his father on the ground, blood pooling around his leg. Patrick's face went completely white. He stared at the blood, then at Maple's doorway, then at me and Sophie on the floor. My husband was still screaming threats between gasps of pain, trying to pull the knife out of his thigh with shaking hands. Patrick snapped out of his shock and pulled his phone from his pocket. His hands were shaking so bad he almost dropped it twice before he managed to dial. I heard him say the address, say someone's been stabbed, say we need help now. I crawled toward my husband, because I couldn't just let him bleed out no matter what he'd done to us. I grabbed towels from Sophie's bathroom, my vision going spotty from the pain in my head. I pressed the towels against the wound in his leg. Blood soaked through immediately, hot and sticky on my hands. I pushed harder, even though my hands wouldn't stop shaking. He kept screaming at me that he was going to kill us, that we were all dead, that Maple was a monster who deserved to rot in jail. I looked past him into Maple's room. She was still standing next to her bed, still holding the knife with both hands, staring at her father like she was watching something on TV instead of real life. The blood on her small hands looked black in the nightlight's glow. Patrick finished the call and dropped down next to me, pressing his hands over mine on the towels. We didn't say anything to each other. Sophie was still sobbing behind us. My husband kept screaming. Maple didn't move at all. The sirens started maybe 8 minutes later, but it felt like hours. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. I heard car doors slamming, heavy footsteps on the stairs, voices calling out. 3 paramedics came up the stairs fast. The first one went straight to my husband, kneeling in the blood and checking his pulse. The second one came to me and Sophie, shining a light in my eyes and asking me questions I couldn't focus on. The third one walked slowly into Maple's room with her hands up, talking in this really calm voice. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but she kept talking and talking until finally Maple's grip on the knife loosened. The paramedic held out a plastic bag and Maple dropped the knife into it. The paramedic sealed it and set it aside, then wrapped a blanket around Maple's shoulders. Police officers filled the hallway. One of them started taking pictures of everything. Another one was talking into his radio. A third one tried to separate me from Sophie, but she screamed and grabbed onto my arm so hard her nails broke skin. The officer backed off and let us stay together. A detective showed up maybe 10 minutes after the first responders. He was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and tired eyes. He looked at the blood on the walls from earlier when my husband had thrown me. He looked at the broken furniture in Sophie's room. He looked at my 3 kids, all of them terrified and hurt. He looked at my visible injuries, the cut on my shoulder still bleeding, the bruises on my arms. He pulled out his phone and made a call, saying he needed backup and CPS right away. He said this wasn't just an assault. This was years of domestic violence finally coming to a head. The paramedics loaded my husband onto a stretcher. He was still conscious and still screaming threats at all of us. A police officer stayed right next to the stretcher, one hand on his gun. The detective told the officer my husband was under arrest as soon as the doctors cleared him. They carried him down the stairs and out to the ambulance. I rode in a different ambulance with Sophie still clinging to my arm. The paramedic in the back with us was young, maybe mid-20s. She cleaned the cut on my shoulder while we drove. She asked me how long the abuse had been going on. I don't know why I answered honestly. Maybe because I was too tired to lie anymore. I told her years. It's been years. Sophie squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. I looked down at my 12-year-old daughter and realized she'd been protecting me emotionally this whole time, trying to make me feel less guilty by pretending she was okay. I'd failed to protect her physically, and she'd been protecting me anyway. Patrick and Maple rode in separate ambulances behind us. I could see the flashing lights through the back window. We got to the hospital around 3:30 in the morning. They took us to different rooms in the emergency department. A doctor came in to see me and Sophie. Her name tag said, Dr. Harrell. She had kind eyes, but her voice was all business. She examined my head wound first, shining lights in my eyes and asking me questions to check for concussion. Then she looked at my shoulder, cleaning out the glass and stitching it up. She took pictures of everything with a camera. The bruises on my arm from tonight, the older bruises from last week that were turning yellow, the cut on my shoulder, the bump on the back of my head, my back injury. She photographed all of it while explaining that she was a mandated reporter and CPS was already on their way. I felt this weird mix of relief and terror. Relief because someone was finally going to know the truth. Terror because I knew once this process started, I had no control over what happened to my children. Dr. Harrell moved to Sophie next, gently examining her shoulder. Sophie flinched away from every touch, but let the doctor check her. Dr. Harrell said it wasn't broken, just badly bruised, and wrapped it for support. A woman arrived at the hospital around 4 in the morning. She introduced herself as Grace Pennington from Child Protective Services. She had a folder under her arm and this professional but not unkind expression. She explained that she needed to interview each of us separately about what happened. She started with me, asking detailed questions about tonight and about the history of abuse. I answered everything. I told her about Patrick's broken ribs 3 weeks ago, about Sophie hiding in her closet during the violent nights, about how this happened every few weeks when my husband drank. Grace wrote everything down without showing much reaction. Then she told me the part I'd been dreading. She said the children would need to be placed in temporary protective custody while the situation was assessed. I wanted to argue, to promise I would keep them safe now, but the words stuck in my throat. We both knew I hadn't kept them safe before. Grace went to talk to Patrick next. I could hear him through the wall. His voice got louder and louder until he was shouting. He yelled that he wasn't leaving his sisters. He yelled that I was the one who should have protected them years ago. His anger was worse than any of my husband's punches, because Patrick was right. Grace's voice stayed calm, explaining that this was standard procedure in cases involving violence with weapons and ongoing threats. She said it was temporary, that the goal was reunification. Patrick kept yelling, but eventually his voice got quieter. Sophie was in the room next to mine. I couldn't hear words, but I could hear nurses trying to talk to her. She wasn't responding. When I looked through the window in the door, I saw her rocking back and forth on the hospital bed, holding her wrapped shoulder. A nurse tried to touch her arm, and Sophie jerked away so hard she almost fell off the bed. I watched my 12-year-old daughter disappear into herself, right in front of me. This was my fault. I'd taught her for years that hiding and silence were the only ways to survive. Now she couldn't find her voice, even when she was finally safe. Maple was in a different part of the emergency department. Grace told me they'd called in a child psychiatrist because Maple had stabbed someone at age 7. They needed to assess whether she was a danger to herself or others. I walked down the hall and found the room where they had her. Through the window, I could see Maple sitting in a chair, answering questions from a doctor. She looked so calm. No tears, no emotion, just sitting there like she was taking a test at the school. The little girl who was afraid of monsters under her bed had just stabbed her father to protect her family. I didn't know how she would ever recover from carrying that weight. Grace came back around 6 in the morning with a folder and this tired look on her face. She pulled a chair next to where I was sitting outside Maple's evaluation room. She opened the folder and started explaining the placement plan. Patrick would go to one foster home, Sophie to another, Maple to a specialized therapeutic placement because of what happened with the knife. They had to separate them for individual assessments, given the severity of everything. I heard the words, but they didn't make sense at first. My kids had never been apart, not for a single night in their whole lives. I asked if they could stay together, my voice breaking. Grace shook her head and said it wasn't possible right now, that this was standard procedure for cases involving weapons and multiple victims. I looked through the window at Maple still sitting calmly with the psychiatrist. Then I looked down the hall where Patrick was in one room and Sophie in another. They didn't know yet. Grace stood up and said she needed to tell them now. I followed her to Patrick's room first. He was sitting on the hospital bed with his arms crossed, staring at the wall. Grace explained the temporary custody arrangement and the separate placements. Patrick's head snapped toward her. He asked if she was serious. She said yes and started explaining the reasons. Patrick exploded off the bed, yelling that he wasn't leaving his sisters, that someone had to protect them. Grace stayed calm and told him the goal was reunification, but this was necessary for now. Patrick turned to me, his face red. He asked why I didn't leave years ago when this could have been prevented. He said he'd been planning to call CPS himself when he turned 16, so he could try to keep custody of Sophie and Maple. His words hit me like physical blows. My 15-year-old son had been planning to rescue his siblings from a situation I should have ended years ago. Grace put her hand on Patrick's shoulder, but he shrugged it off. She told him his foster father would arrive soon, and he'd be in good hands. Patrick laughed this bitter sound and said he didn't need anyone's hands. He needed his mother to have protected them. Then he sat back down and wouldn't look at me anymore. We went to Sophie's room next. She was still rocking on the bed, holding her wrapped shoulder. Grace knelt down in front of her and explained gently about the foster placement. Sophie's eyes got wider, but she didn't make a sound. Grace said a very experienced foster mother was coming to get her. Sophie reached for my hand and gripped it so hard her knuckles turned white. I tried to tell her it would be okay, but the words stuck in my throat because I didn't know if that was true. Sophie started making these small, whimpering sounds, but still no words. Grace touched her other hand, and Sophie flinched away. We left her there still rocking, and I felt like I was abandoning her all over again. Maple's evaluation finished, and the psychiatrist came out. He told Grace that Maple showed signs of delayed trauma response, but wasn't an immediate danger to herself or others. He recommended intensive therapy and a specialized placement. Grace nodded, and we went into the room together. Maple looked up at us with those big eyes. Grace explained about the foster home using simple words. Maple listened without showing much emotion. Then she asked in this tiny voice if she was going to jail like Daddy. I dropped to my knees in front of her and told her no, that she protected us, that she was brave. Maple looked at me and asked if brave people hurt other people. I didn't know how to answer that. I told her she did what she had to do to keep us safe. She asked if that made her bad. I said no, but I could see in her face that she didn't believe me. Grace said Maple's foster mother had special training for children in difficult situations. Maple asked if the other kids there hurt people too. Grace paused, then said some of them had been through very hard things. Maple nodded like that made sense. Around 7:30, a man arrived at the hospital. Grace introduced him as Phil Pennington, her husband. He specialized in fostering teenage boys from crisis situations. Phil was tall with gray hair, and he had this quiet way about him. He shook Patrick's hand and told him he had a room ready at his house. Patrick didn't say anything. Phil didn't try to force conversation or pretend this was okay. He just waited. Grace handed Phil some paperwork, and they talked quietly about Patrick's injuries and medications. Patrick stood there with his arms crossed, not looking at any of us. When it was time to leave, Phil picked up the bag the hospital had given us with Patrick's belongings. Patrick walked toward the door without saying goodbye to me. I tried to say something, but he kept walking. Phil followed him out, and I watched my son disappear down the hallway, his anger and disappointment radiating off him in waves. Sophie's foster mother arrived around 8. She was in her 50s with kind eyes and this calm presence. Grace introduced her, but I didn't catch her name through the ringing in my ears. The woman went into Sophie's room and knelt down. She spoke softly to Sophie, telling her about the house and the room she'd prepared. Sophie didn't respond. The foster mother didn't push. She just stayed there at Sophie's level, being patient. When it was time to go, Sophie grabbed my hand again. The foster mother gently tried to help Sophie stand, but Sophie wouldn't let go of me. Her whimpering got louder. Grace and the foster mother exchanged looks. They both tried to talk to Sophie, but she just held my hand tighter, making these horrible sounds, but still not speaking actual words. Finally, the foster mother had to carefully pry Sophie's fingers away one by one. Sophie's face crumpled and tears ran down her cheeks as the woman led her toward the door. I stood there frozen, watching my 12-year-old daughter being taken away while she looked back at me with this expression of complete betrayal. Something fundamental broke inside me in that moment. Maple's placement took the longest to arrange. Grace made multiple phone calls trying to find someone with the right training and an available bed. We waited in the hospital room together, Maple coloring a picture the nurses had given her. She drew our family, but left out her father. Around 9, the placement was finally confirmed. Grace explained to Maple that a special foster mother was coming, but it would take a while because she lived further away. Maple asked if she'd have her own room. Grace said yes. Maple asked if there would be a nightlight. Grace called the foster mother and confirmed yes, there would be a nightlight. Maple seemed satisfied with that. While we waited, Maple looked up at me and asked again if she was really not going to jail. I sat next to her and told her no, that police only arrest people who hurt others to be mean, not people who protect their families. Maple asked how the police knew the difference. I didn't have a good answer. I told her the police knew she was trying to help us. Maple was quiet for a minute, then asked if Daddy was going to jail because he was mean. I said yes. She asked if he'd be there forever. I told her I didn't know, but he wouldn't be able to hurt us anymore. Maple nodded and went back to coloring. By 9 in the morning, all 3 of my children were gone, and I was alone in the hospital. A nurse came to check my injuries and change the bandages on my shoulder and head. My back still hurt badly, but the doctor said nothing was broken, just severe bruising and muscle damage. While the nurse worked, Detective Monroe came back. He had a recording device and a notepad. He pulled a chair close and told me he needed my official statement about everything. I started talking, and once I started, I couldn't stop. I told him about the years of abuse, about Patrick's broken ribs 3 weeks ago, about Sophie hiding in her closet during the violent nights, how I found her asleep sitting up with numb legs, about the pattern of violence every few weeks when my husband drank, about how I thought Maple didn't know, about how wrong I was. Monroe wrote everything down, his expression getting grimmer with each detail. He asked specific questions about dates and injuries and witnesses. I answered everything. When I finished, He turned off the recorder and told me criminal charges were inevitable, given the evidence and the number of victims. He said my husband would likely face serious prison time. I felt relief and terror at the same time because my husband had threatened to kill us all. Monroe seemed to read my mind. He said my husband was under guard at the hospital and would be transferred directly to jail when released. He said a restraining order would be filed automatically. Grace came back around 10:30 with a stack of paperwork. She sat down and went through each form, explaining what I was signing: temporary custody acknowledgement, rights during the separation period, reunification process overview, requirements for getting my children back. She was honest in a way that hurt. She said this would take months, not weeks. I'd need to complete parenting classes and therapy. I'd have to prove I could protect my children. She said the court would be watching everything I did. I signed each paper with shaking hands, reading words like failure to protect and enabling environment and risk assessment. The reality of what was happening crashed over me. I'd lost my children because I failed to protect them from their father. Grace gathered the papers and put them back in her folder. She told me I could have supervised visits starting in a few days. She gave me a list of therapists who specialized in domestic violence survivors and parenting classes I was required to attend. She also gave me referrals for support groups. The list felt overwhelming, but I wrote down every appointment time and location. Grace asked if I had a way to get home. I told her my husband controlled all our vehicles and finances. She offered to drive me. Around noon, I was discharged with prescriptions for pain medication and instructions to follow up with my doctor in a week. Grace drove me home in her car, neither of us talking much. When we pulled up to the house, I saw the front door was still slightly open from when the paramedics had come through. Grace walked me inside, and I immediately saw the blood on the walls, on the floors, in Sophie's room, in Maple's room, the kitchen where he'd smashed plates, broken glass everywhere. Grace asked if I wanted her to stay while I cleaned. I said no. She reminded me about the therapy appointments and left. I stood in the kitchen staring at the blood on the floor where I'd crawled after him. I got cleaning supplies from under the sink and started scrubbing. The blood had dried and didn't come up easily. I scrubbed harder, crying so hard I could barely see what I was doing. I moved to the living room wall where my head had hit the picture frame. Glass was still scattered on the floor. I picked up each piece carefully, remembering how the shard had sliced my shoulder. Every room held memories of violence I'd ignored or minimized. The kitchen where he'd smashed plates against the walls looking for his pills. Sophie's room where he'd dragged her from the closet by her arm. The hallway where he'd kicked me. Maple's room where she'd stabbed him with the knife she'd taken from the kitchen drawer. I cleaned Maple's room last, scrubbing the blood from her floor where he'd fallen. Her nightlight was still on. Her bed was unmade from where she'd been hiding under the covers. I sat on her bed and held her pillow and sobbed until I couldn't breathe. The house felt haunted by my failures as a mother. Around 6 that evening, my phone rang. It was Detective Monroe. He told me my husband was out of surgery and under arrest in his hospital room with an officer posted outside. The surgery had repaired the damage to his femoral artery. He'd be moved to jail as soon as doctors cleared him. Monroe listed the charges being filed: multiple counts of domestic violence, child abuse, aggravated assault. He said I'd need to testify at the preliminary hearing and eventually at trial. He explained that a restraining order had been filed and was now active. My husband wasn't allowed any contact with me or the children. The relief I felt hearing this was immediately followed by terror, remembering his threats to kill us all. Monroe seemed to hear my fear through the phone. He gave me his direct number and told me to call immediately if anything felt wrong or if my husband's family tried to contact me. I thanked him and hung up. I ordered food delivery because I couldn't handle going to the store. I ate without tasting anything, sitting at the kitchen table in the quiet house. Every sound made me jump. A car door outside, the house settling, the refrigerator humming. Each noise made my heart race, convinced my husband had somehow escaped and was coming back. I checked all the locks on the doors and windows. Then I checked them again, and again. I couldn't stop checking. Around 11, I tried to go to bed, but I couldn't stay in the bedroom where he'd slept. I went to the living room couch instead with my phone in my hand, and Monroe's number pulled up ready to call. I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, listening. Every car that passed made me freeze. Every sound from outside made me reach for my phone. Around midnight, I went to the kitchen and opened the knife drawer. I took out the same type of knife Maple had used and brought it back to the couch. I put it under the pillow next to me. Then I realized what I was doing. I was sleeping on the couch with a knife under my pillow, becoming exactly what my 7-year-old daughter had been forced to become. That first night alone in the house was the worst night of my life. I didn't sleep. I just sat there in the dark, checking the locks every hour, jumping at every sound, gripping the knife handle under the pillow, and crying because I'd failed my children so badly that my baby girl had to do what I should have done years ago. The next morning, my phone rang while I was still on the couch. I hadn't moved since checking the locks for the 10th time around 5 a.m. Grace's number showed on the screen. I answered, and she told me she'd scheduled my first supervised visit with the kids in 3 days. 1 hour only. A supervised location downtown. I couldn't discuss the case or their father during the visit. She also gave me names and numbers for therapists who work with domestic violence survivors and support groups I had to attend. The list went on and on. Parenting classes, individual therapy, group therapy, home safety assessments. I grabbed a pen and paper from the kitchen and wrote everything down. My hand shook so badly the writing looked like a child's. Grace asked if I understood all the requirements, and I said yes, even though the list felt impossible. She said she'd check in tomorrow and hung up. I sat there staring at the paper covered in my shaky handwriting. 10 different appointments and requirements, all proof that I'd failed so badly the state had to teach me how to be a mother. I called the first therapist on the list that afternoon. She had an opening the next day. I took it. The office was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a pizza place. The waiting room had magazines about parenting and pamphlets about domestic violence. I filled out forms asking about the abuse. How long? How often? What kind? I checked boxes for physical violence, emotional abuse, financial control. The form had 20 questions, and I checked yes to 18 of them. The therapist called me back after 15 minutes. Her name was on the door, but I didn't catch it. She was maybe 50 with gray hair and glasses. Her office had tissues on every surface. She sat across from me and asked me to tell her what happened. I started with that night. She stopped me. She said we needed to talk about why I stayed for years while my children were being hurt. Her voice wasn't mean, but it was direct. She said I enabled the abuse by not protecting my kids. I wanted to explain about being scared and having no money and not knowing how to leave. She held up her hand. She said those were reasons, but not excuses. She said my job was to protect my children, and I didn't do it. I sat there and cried while she handed me tissues. She asked if I was ready to take responsibility without hiding behind my fear. I said yes, but I wasn't sure I meant it. My phone started ringing that evening. I didn't recognize the number. I let it go to voicemail. My husband's mother's voice came through the speaker. She was crying. She said she needed to know what happened. She said her son would never hurt anyone. She said there must be some mistake. I deleted it without listening to the whole thing. She called again an hour later. This time her voice was angry. She said I was turning the kids against their father. She said I was destroying their family. She called me a liar. The third voicemail came at 10 p.m. My father-in-law this time. He said they'd fight for custody if I kept lying about their son. He said they had lawyers. He said I'd regret this. I played that one twice and saved it like Monroe told me to. The idea of my in-laws getting custody made me want to throw up. They'd raised my husband. They'd taught him that violence was acceptable. They'd never once asked about the bruises I'd shown up with over the years. 3 days later, I drove to the supervised visit location, a building downtown that CPS used for family visits. Gray carpet and white walls and cameras in every corner. I got there early and sat in my car for 20 minutes. I couldn't make myself go inside. Finally, I forced myself out and walked to the entrance. A woman at the front desk checked my ID and pointed me to a room down the hall. The supervisor was already there. She introduced herself, but I forgot her name immediately. She explained the rules again. 1 hour. No discussion of the case. No physical contact without permission. She'd be in the room the whole time taking notes. Then the door opened, and my kids walked in. Patrick came first. He was taller than I remembered. He wouldn't look at me. He sat in a chair against the far wall and crossed his arms. Sophie came next, holding the hand of her foster mother. She stared at the floor. Her foster mother whispered something to her and left. Sophie sat in another chair and kept her eyes down. Then Maple ran through the door and straight to me. She wrapped her arms around my waist. I started to hug her back, but the supervisor said I needed to ask permission first. I asked Maple if I could hug her. She nodded into my stomach. I held her, and she felt so small. She pulled back and looked up at me. She asked if she was a bad person for hurting Daddy. I knelt down so we were eye level. I told her no. I told her she protected us. I told her she was brave. The supervisor wrote something on her clipboard. Patrick's voice cut through the room, cold and flat. He asked why I didn't leave years ago when Daddy first hurt him. He said he remembered being 12 and having his ribs broken and me telling him it would be okay. He said he'd been planning to call CPS himself when he turned 16. He said he was just waiting until he was old enough to maybe keep custody of his sisters. He said he'd been counting down the days for 3 years. I stared at my 15-year-old son and realized he'd been planning to rescue his siblings from a situation I should have ended. He'd been 12 years old making plans to save his family because his mother wouldn't. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. What could I possibly say? The supervisor shifted in her seat but didn't interrupt. Patrick looked at me with so much anger and disappointment that I had to look away. Sophie stood up from her chair and walked over to me. She had a piece of paper folded in her hand. She held it out, and I took it. I unfolded it. 3 words in shaky handwriting. "I'm scared, Mommy." The letters were barely legible, like her hand had been shaking as badly as mine when I wrote down Grace's requirements. I looked at Sophie, and she had tears running down her face, but she still wouldn't make a sound. I asked the supervisor if I could hug her. The supervisor nodded. I pulled Sophie close and she grabbed onto my shirt. I whispered that I was scared too. I whispered that we'd be okay. I didn't know if that was true, but I said it anyway. Sophie held on so tight I could barely breathe. The supervisor checked her watch and said we had 10 minutes left. Maple started talking about her foster home. She said it like she was describing a field trip at the school, matter of fact and detailed. She said there were 4 other kids there. She said they'd all hurt people too. She asked if that meant they were all bad together. The supervisor spoke up gently. She said those were questions for Maple's therapist. She redirected the conversation to asking Maple about school and friends. But I saw it in Maple's eyes. The confusion about whether protecting your family made you a bad person. The weight of what she'd done sitting on her 7-year-old shoulders. My baby girl thought she was bad because I'd put her in a position where she had to save us. The supervisor announced time was up. Patrick stood immediately and walked to the door without looking back. Sophie's foster mother came to collect her. Sophie held on to me until the woman gently pulled her away. Maple gave me one more hug and asked when she could come home. I told her soon. I told her I loved her. Then they were all gone, and I was alone in the room with the supervisor. The supervisor said the visit went as well as could be expected. She said these things take time. I nodded and walked out to my car. I sat in the driver's seat and sobbed for 20 minutes. The visit had felt wrong and artificial. Nothing like our real family. I was terrified that awkward distance would become permanent, that my kids would never forgive me, that I'd destroyed us all by waiting too long. Grace knocked on my car window. I rolled it down. She said she knew it was hard, but this was progress. She said I needed to keep showing up. I wiped my face and nodded. That evening, I went to my first domestic violence support group, a church basement with folding chairs in a circle. 8 other women already sitting when I arrived. The facilitator asked me to introduce myself. I said my name and that my husband had been abusing me and my kids for years. The facilitator thanked me and asked who wanted to share. The women went around the circle telling their stories. One woman's husband had broken her jaw. Another woman's boyfriend had held her at gunpoint. A third woman had been out for 5 years and still couldn't sleep without medication. Their stories were worse than mine, or exactly like mine, or different, but the same. I felt less alone, but also more ashamed. These women had left. Some had left sooner than me. Some had protected their kids better. One woman looked at me and said the hardest part was forgiving yourself. She said she still hadn't managed it after 3 years. That terrified me more than anything else. The idea that this guilt would never go away. I got home around 9 p.m. and my phone rang. Monroe's number. I answered, and he told me my husband was released from the hospital to jail. He'd await his court date there. The restraining order was active now. My husband couldn't contact me or the kids. Monroe said my husband's family might try to pressure me to drop charges. He said to document everything. Every call, every visit, every message. He said if the harassment continued, I could get my own restraining order against them. I thanked him and hung up. I checked all the locks again. I made sure the windows were secure. Then I sat on the couch in the dark and thought about Patrick planning to rescue his sisters at 16, about Sophie's note saying she was scared, about Maple asking if she was bad, about how I'd failed all 3 of them in ways I could never fix. The knife was still under the couch pillow. I left it there and eventually fell asleep sitting up, still listening for sounds that wouldn't come. 2 days passed in a blur of cleaning and checking locks and jumping at every sound. I barely slept. I kept the knife under the couch pillow, even though I knew my husband was in jail. On the 3rd morning after the visit, someone knocked on my front door around 10 a.m. I looked through the peephole and saw my husband's mother standing on the porch. She was crying. I opened the door but kept the chain lock on. She pushed against it immediately, begging to come inside. Her face was red and swollen from crying. She said she needed to talk to me about her son. I told her through the gap that there was nothing to talk about. She grabbed the door frame and said the police had it all wrong. She said her son had a drinking problem, but he wasn't a monster. She kept using that word, monster, like the abuse was just a mistake or a phase. I started to close the door, but she shoved her hand through the gap. She begged me to tell the police it was all a misunderstanding, that we could work it out as a family, that her grandchildren needed their father. I pulled the door open wider and looked at her directly. I told her about Patrick's broken ribs, about Sophie hiding in closets, about Maple stabbing her own father because I couldn't protect her. My mother-in-law's face changed. The crying stopped. She called me a liar. She said I was destroying her family. She said I probably hit myself and coached the kids to lie. She said she'd fight me for custody. Then she left. I closed the door and locked it and checked it 3 times. My hands shook so badly, I could barely dial Detective Monroe's number. He answered on the 2nd ring. I told him about the visit. He asked if she threatened me directly. I said not exactly, but she said she'd fight for custody. He made notes and explained that technically she didn't violate the restraining order since it only applied to my husband. But he said if she kept showing up, it could be considered witness intimidation. He suggested I get my own restraining order against the in-laws. The idea exhausted me. More paperwork, more court, more legal fees I couldn't afford. But I said okay. Monroe said he'd document everything and send the report to the prosecutor. That afternoon, I had my therapy session. The counselor's office was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax place. I sat in the waiting room for 10 minutes before she called me back. Her office smelled like lavender. She asked how I was doing. I told her about my husband's mother showing up. She wrote something down. Then she asked about my own mother. I said my mother had nothing to do with this. The counselor leaned forward and said she thought my mother had everything to do with this. She asked if my father had been violent. I didn't answer at first. She waited. Finally, I said yes. My father hit my mother. My mother stayed. The counselor asked why I thought my mother stayed. I said I didn't know. She said I did know. She pushed and pushed until I admitted that my mother taught me this was normal, that men got angry, that women endured it, that keeping the family together mattered more than anything else. The counselor asked if I saw the pattern. I did. I saw it clearly. I had become my mother. I had subjected my children to the exact same trauma I experienced as a child. The realization hit me so hard I couldn't breathe. I started crying. Then I couldn't stop. I said I was no better than my husband. The counselor's voice got sharp. She said that wasn't true. She said there was a difference between being a victim who stayed and being an active abuser. I shook my head. I said I enabled him. I protected him by staying silent. I chose him over my kids' safety for years. The counselor made me look at her. She said I was a victim who made bad choices out of fear and learned helplessness. She said my husband was an abuser who chose violence. She said those were not the same thing. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't. The distinction felt too small, too convenient. The following week, I started the required parenting classes. The classroom was in a community center basement, folding chairs arranged in a circle. 11 other parents already sitting when I walked in. The instructor introduced herself and asked us to go around sharing why we were there. One woman's boyfriend broke her daughter's arm. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. One man's girlfriend left their kids alone for 3 days. Another woman admitted she hit her son with a belt until he had welts. We all sat there in our shame. The instructor talked about recognizing abuse patterns, about protecting children, about setting boundaries, about breaking generational trauma. Every single thing she said felt like she was pointing directly at me. I took notes on everything, filled up 6 pages, completed every worksheet, answered every question. I needed to prove I could do this, that I could be the mother my kids deserved. 2 weeks into the classes, Grace scheduled a home visit. She showed up at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday with a clipboard and a serious expression. She walked through every room in my house, checked the locks on all the doors and windows, looked in closets and cabinets, asked about my safety plan if my husband's family showed up again. I showed her the new deadbolts I'd installed, the security system I couldn't really afford but bought anyway, the list of emergency contacts taped to the refrigerator. She asked about my therapy attendance. I showed her the appointment cards. She asked about the parenting classes. I showed her my notebook full of notes. She asked if there was any alcohol in the house. I said no, and opened every cabinet to prove it. She wrote everything down. Then she sat at my kitchen table and reviewed her notes. She said I was making good progress. She said the next step would be increasing the supervised visits. She said we'd start with 2 hours instead of 1. I felt relief and terror at the same time. The second supervised visit happened 2 weeks after the first. Patrick arrived before his sisters. He sat in the same chair as last time but didn't cross his arms. The supervisor said he could sit wherever he wanted. He stayed where he was. I asked how he was doing. He said fine. I asked about school. He said it was okay. Then he started talking about Phil. He said Phil treated him with respect, that Phil actually listened when he talked. that Phil asked his opinion about things and didn't just tell him what to do. I said I was glad he had a good placement. Patrick looked at me and said, Phil made him feel safe. The words cut deep. Another man was providing the safety and stability I'd failed to give him for 15 years. I swallowed hard and said I was grateful Phil was taking good care of him. Patrick nodded and looked away. Sophie arrived next with her foster mother. She was carrying a piece of paper folded in half. The supervisor said Sophie had been working with an art therapist. Sophie handed me the paper. I unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing of our family, me and 3 kids. But where the father figure should have been, there was just black marker scribbled, so violently it had torn through the paper in places. The supervisor explained that Sophie's therapist encouraged her to express her feelings visually since she still wouldn't speak. She said this was progress, that Sophie was processing her trauma. I stared at the violent black scribbles and felt sick. My 12-year-old daughter had so much rage, she'd torn through paper trying to erase her father. Maple came in last. Her therapeutic foster mother walked her to the door and gave her a hug before leaving. Maple looked smaller than 2 weeks ago, like she was shrinking into herself. She sat next to me and leaned against my side. Grace arrived a few minutes later. She asked to speak with me privately for a moment. We stepped into the hallway. Grace said Maple's foster mother had reported that Maple was having nightmares about the stabbing, waking up screaming that there was blood on her hands. Grace said Maple kept asking if she was going to jail, if she was a bad person, if God was mad at her. I felt my chest tighten. My 7-year-old was carrying guilt that should have been mine. Grace said Maple's therapist was working with her, but wanted to meet with me too. She gave me a card with his name and number, Cormac Sutton. I called him the next day, and he had an opening that afternoon. His office was in a medical building downtown. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40. He had kind eyes. He asked me to sit, and then explained what he'd been working on with Maple. He said she was experiencing something called moral injury. She had done something violent to protect her family, but at 7 years old, she couldn't reconcile that protective violence with her understanding of right and wrong. He said Maple kept asking if hurting someone made her bad, even if she was trying to help. He said she was struggling with the weight of adult problems that should never have been hers to carry. I started crying again. Cormac handed me tissues and waited. Then he said his goal was to help Maple understand she wasn't responsible for adult problems, that she had been put in an impossible situation by the adults who should have protected her. He meant me. He didn't say it directly, but I heard it. I had put my 7-year-old in a position where she had to stab her own father. Cormac said Maple would need ongoing therapy for a long time. He said the moral injury was serious and wouldn't resolve quickly, but he was confident she could heal if she had consistent support and safety. He asked if I was committed to providing that. I said yes, I would do whatever it took. 2 days later, a woman named Eliza Bradshaw called my cell phone. She introduced herself as the prosecutor handling my husband's case. Her voice was professional but not cold. She asked if I had time to talk, and I said yes immediately. Eliza explained that my husband was charged with 3 counts of aggravated assault, 2 counts of child endangerment, and 1 count of domestic violence. She said with 3 child victims and documented injuries, the district attorney's office was pursuing serious charges. She needed me to testify at the preliminary hearing in 3 weeks. I wrote down the date and time on a piece of paper with shaking hands. Then Eliza warned me that my husband's public defender would try to paint me as an unfit mother who enabled the abuse. She said they'd argue I was equally responsible for not protecting my children. Her words hit me like a physical blow because that's exactly what I believed about myself. Eliza must have heard something in my silence because she said I was a victim too, and that the defense attorney's job was to create doubt. She told me to prepare myself mentally for the hearing and said she'd call again before the date to go over my testimony. After we hung up, I sat on my couch staring at the paper with the hearing date written on it. 3 weeks felt both too soon and impossibly far away. The 3 weeks passed in a blur of therapy appointments and supervised visits and constant anxiety about facing my husband in court. The morning of the preliminary hearing, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror trying to decide what to wear. Grace had told me to dress conservatively and professionally. I chose a navy blue dress that covered my arms and the fading bruises. My hands shook so badly I could barely zip it up. I drove to the courthouse 40 minutes early and sat in my car in the parking lot trying to calm down. Other people walked past carrying briefcases and coffee cups like this was just another normal day. For them, maybe it was. For me, it felt like walking into a nightmare. I finally forced myself to get out of the car and walk inside. The courthouse was cold and smelled like floor cleaner. Eliza met me in the hallway outside the courtroom. She was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back tight. She shook my hand and asked how I was holding up. I lied and said I was okay. She walked me through what would happen during the hearing. The judge would hear arguments about bail and review the charges. I wouldn't have to testify today, but I'd be in the courtroom, and my husband would be there too. My stomach twisted. Eliza put her hand on my arm briefly and said I could do this. We walked into the courtroom, and I sat in the front row behind the prosecutor's table. The room was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights. A few other people sat scattered around, probably there for different cases. Then a side door opened, and a bailiff brought my husband in. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked smaller somehow, thinner. His hair was longer and uncombed, but when he turned and saw me sitting there, his expression changed instantly to pure hatred. His eyes locked on mine, and I felt my breath catch. The bailiff made him sit at the defense table next to his public defender. My husband kept turning his head to stare at me. The public defender, a tired-looking man in a wrinkled suit, put his hand on my husband's arm and said something I couldn't hear. The judge entered, and everyone stood. Judge Kent was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and reading glasses. She sat down and shuffled through papers. The hearing started with the prosecutor reading the charges: aggravated assault against a minor, child endangerment, domestic violence. Each charge felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. The public defender stood and argued for reduced bail. He said my husband had lived in the community for 15 years, had stable employment before his arrest, and wasn't a flight risk. He said my husband had a drinking problem that he was willing to address through treatment. He made it sound like alcoholism was an excuse for breaking our son's ribs and terrorizing our children. Eliza stood and argued against any bail. She described the severity of the injuries to all 3 children. She read from the police report about the threats my husband made that night. She mentioned that a 7-year-old child had been forced to stab her own father in self-defense. Judge Kent listened to both sides without expression. Then she denied bail. She said, given the threats made against the family and the severity of injuries to multiple minor victims, she couldn't risk releasing the defendant. My husband exploded. He stood up and started yelling that this was bullshit, that I'd turned his kids against him, that he'd never hurt anyone. The bailiff grabbed his arm and forced him back into his chair. Judge Kent banged her gavel and warned him about contempt. My husband's face was red and his jaw was clenched. He looked at me again and mouthed something I couldn't quite make out, but looked like a threat. The bailiff led him back through the side door. My whole body was shaking. After the hearing ended, I stood up on trembling legs and started walking toward the exit. Eliza was gathering her papers at the prosecutor's table. I was almost to the door when someone called my name. I turned and saw my husband's public defender walking toward me. He had a fake, concerned expression on his face. He said he understood this was a difficult situation for everyone. Then he suggested I might want to reconsider my testimony when the trial came. He said things could get very uncomfortable for me on the stand. He implied that I was equally responsible for what happened because I'd stayed and hadn't protected my children. He said a good defense attorney could make me look very bad in front of a jury. Before I could respond, Eliza appeared next to me. Her professional demeanor was gone, and her voice was sharp. She told the defense attorney that witness intimidation wouldn't be tolerated, and if he approached her witness again outside of official proceedings, she'd file a complaint with the Bar Association. The attorney held up his hands and said he was just trying to have a conversation. Eliza told him the conversation was over and took my elbow, guiding me away. We walked down the hallway, and she didn't let go until we were outside the courthouse. She asked if I was okay. I nodded, but I wasn't. The defense attorney's words had shaken me because they echoed everything I already believed about myself. I was equally responsible. I had stayed. I hadn't protected my children. Eliza seemed to read my thoughts. She said the defense would try to shift blame onto me, but that didn't make it true. She said I was a victim of domestic violence, and the law recognized that. But her words didn't help much, because the guilt was already eating me alive. I drove home in a daze and spent the rest of the day sitting on my couch replaying the hearing in my mind. My husband's hateful stare, the judge denying bail, the defense attorney's thinly veiled threats. That evening my phone rang. I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the number. But I picked up and heard a man's voice asking if this was Patrick's mother. I said yes. He introduced himself as Phil Pennington, Patrick's foster father. I was surprised because most communication went through Grace. Phil said he hoped it was okay that he called directly. Grace had given him my number. He wanted to talk to me about Patrick. My stomach tightened. Phil quickly reassured me that Patrick was physically fine, but he said Patrick had been opening up about the abuse over the past few weeks. He'd been talking about his guilt for not protecting his sisters sooner. Phil said Patrick carried a lot of anger, and a misplaced sense of responsibility. He thought Patrick would benefit from family therapy once reunification planning began. He said Patrick needed to work through his anger at me in a safe environment. I felt tears start, but I blinked them back. I told Phil I'd do whatever Patrick needed. Phil's voice was kind when he said that was good to hear. He said he'd been working with traumatized teens for 12 years, and Patrick was a good kid dealing with impossible circumstances. He said Patrick loved his sisters fiercely and had been trying to be the man of the house since he was 12. That responsibility had been crushing him. I thanked Phil for calling and for taking care of my son. After we hung up, I called Grace and told her about Phil's suggestion. She said she'd been planning to bring up family therapy soon anyway. She scheduled the first session for the following week with just Patrick and me. The therapy office was in a medical building near downtown. I arrived early and sat in the waiting room with sweaty palms. Patrick arrived with Phil 10 minutes later. Patrick barely looked at me. Phil gave his shoulder a squeeze and said he'd be back in an hour. The therapist came out to get us. She was a woman in her 40s with short gray hair and a calm presence. Her name was Dr. Rivera. She led us into her office, which had 2 couches facing each other and a chair where she sat. Patrick chose the couch farthest from me. Dr. Rivera explained that she specialized in domestic violence cases and family reunification. She said the goal of these sessions was to create a safe space for Patrick to express his feelings and for me to listen and take accountability. She emphasized that Patrick's anger was normal and healthy, given what he'd experienced. She asked Patrick if he understood why we were there. He nodded, but didn't speak. Dr. Rivera waited. The silence stretched out. Finally, Patrick said he'd been afraid to sleep for 3 years. His voice was flat. He said every night he'd lie awake listening for his father's footsteps, listening for the sound of breaking glass, or his mother crying, or his sisters screaming. He said he'd trained himself to sleep light, so he could wake up fast if something happened. Even now in Phil's house where he was safe, he couldn't sleep deeply. He still woke up multiple times a night, listening for danger that wasn't there anymore. I felt like someone had punched me in the chest. My 15-year-old son had been suffering from hypervigilance for 3 years, while I'd pretended everything was manageable. Patrick wasn't done. He said our husband had threatened to kill him if he ever called the police or told anyone about the abuse. This happened when Patrick was 12, right after the first time his father broke his arm. His father had taken him to the emergency room and told the doctors Patrick fell off his bike. On the drive home, his father said if Patrick ever told anyone the truth, he'd kill him and make it look like an accident. Patrick said he believed the threat completely, so for 3 years, he'd carried that threat alone. He'd tried to protect Sophie and Maple while managing his own terror. He'd planned escape routes from the house. He'd hidden his sisters when he heard his father coming home drunk. He'd taken beatings meant for them when he could. And the whole time he'd been 12, 13, 14 years old, trying to be the protector, because I wasn't protecting them. Hearing this, understanding the impossible position my son had been in, made me physically ill. I felt bile rise in my throat. Dr. Rivera asked if I needed a moment. I shook my head, even though I felt like I might throw up. Patrick was staring at the floor. His hands were clenched into fists on his knees. Dr. Rivera gently prompted him to continue if he wanted. Patrick looked up at me then, and his eyes were full of rage. He said he was furious at me. He said I'd stayed when I should have left. I'd made excuses for his father. I'd chosen his father over their safety year after year. He said he'd begged me to leave when he was 13, and I'd told him it wasn't that simple. But it was that simple. I should have taken them and left. Instead, I'd let the abuse continue until Maple had to stab someone to make it stop. A 7-year-old had to do what I should have done years ago. I wanted to defend myself, to explain my fear and the financial control and all the reasons I'd felt trapped. But Dr. Rivera had warned me not to make excuses. And Patrick was right. Every word he said was true. So I sat there and took it. I let him tell me exactly how much he hated what I'd done, how much he resented me for putting him in that position, how angry he was that he'd lost 3 years of his childhood to fear and hypervigilance. Dr. Rivera guided the session carefully. She helped Patrick express his anger in specific terms rather than general accusations. She also gently redirected him when his anger started spiraling into cruelty. After Patrick had said everything he needed to say, Dr. Rivera asked me to respond. I looked at my son and said I was sorry. I said he was right about everything. I'd failed to protect him and his sisters. I'd stayed too long. I'd made excuses. I'd put them in danger over and over. I said I couldn't undo the past, but I was committed to doing better now. I wasn't asking for forgiveness because I hadn't earned it. I just wanted him to know I understood how badly I'd failed him. Patrick's jaw was tight. He didn't respond. Dr. Rivera said that was okay. She said accountability without excuses was an important first step. She said we'd continue working together and that healing would take time. The session ended, and Phil came back to pick up Patrick. Patrick left without saying goodbye to me. I drove home crying so hard I had to pull over twice. That evening, Sophie's art therapist called. Her name was Miss Chang. She asked if I could attend one of Sophie's sessions the following week. She wanted me to bring family photos from before the abuse escalated. She explained that she was using phototherapy to help Sophie reconnect with positive memories and separate her father's violence from her entire childhood. Ms. Chang said Sophie needed to know that not every moment of her life had been defined by fear. I agreed immediately. After we hung up, I went to the hall closet where I kept our photo albums. I hadn't looked at them in years. I sat on the floor and opened the first album. Pictures of Patrick as a baby, Sophie as a toddler, Maple's first birthday. I turned pages and watched my children's faces change. In the early photos, they were smiling, really smiling with light in their eyes. I found pictures from a vacation we'd taken when Sophie was 8. We'd gone to the beach. There were photos of all 3 kids building sandcastles and playing in the waves. They looked happy. I looked happy too in those pictures. That was before things got really bad, before the drinking increased and the violence became regular. I kept turning pages and watched the light fade from their faces year by year. By the time Maple was 5, the smiles in photos looked forced, fake. I cried over those albums for 2 hours, grieving for the childhood I'd stolen from my children. The next week, I brought a stack of selected photos to Sophie's therapy session. Mrs. Chang's office was bright and colorful with art supplies everywhere. Sophie was already there working on a painting. She looked up when I came in and gave me a small smile. Mrs. Chang asked us to sit at a table together. She spread out the photos I'd brought. Sophie leaned forward and started looking through them carefully. Her fingers touched each photo gently, like they were fragile. Ms. Chang asked Sophie to pick out moments she remembered being happy. Sophie studied the photos for a long time. Then she pointed to one from that beach vacation, the 4 of us building a sandcastle. Mrs. Chang asked Sophie what she remembered about that day. Sophie didn't speak out loud, but she pulled out her notebook and wrote for several minutes. Then she turned the notebook so Ms. Chang and I could read it. She'd written about how the sand was hot and the water was cold, how Patrick had helped her dig a moat, how I'd brought popsicles, how her father had seemed happy that day too. She wrote that she'd forgotten there were good times. She thought everything had always been scary. Ms. Chang explained to me that Sophie needed to understand her whole childhood wasn't defined by violence, that there had been good moments worth remembering. Those good memories didn't erase the bad ones, but they were still real and still mattered. Sophie picked out 3 more photos of happy moments: a birthday party, a trip to the zoo, Christmas morning when she was 9. For each one, she wrote down what she remembered. Miss Chang said this was important progress, that Sophie was learning to hold both realities at once, the good and the bad, the happy memories and the traumatic ones. The following week, Cormac invited me to observe one of Maple's play therapy sessions through a one-way mirror. I arrived at his office, and he led me to a small observation room. Through the window, I could see Maple sitting on the floor surrounded by dolls and a dollhouse. Cormac sat nearby with a notepad. I put on the headphones he gave me, so I could hear what was happening. Maple picked up a small girl doll and a larger man doll. She made the man doll walk toward the girl doll. Then she made the girl doll pick up a tiny plastic knife. She acted out the stabbing. The girl doll stabbed the man doll in the leg. The man doll fell down. Maple made sounds of the man doll screaming. Then she reset the scene and did it again. This time she changed a small detail. The mother doll came in and stopped the man doll before the girl doll had to use the knife. But then Maple shook her head and reset the scene again. She tried different variations. Sometimes the boy doll helped. Sometimes the other girl doll warned everyone. But each time she came back to the girl doll having to stab the man doll. I watched my 7-year-old daughter act this out over and over. Each repetition was like a knife in my own chest. Cormac's voice came through the headphones. He gently asked Maple why the girl doll had to use the knife. Maple said, "Because nobody else stopped the bad man." Cormac asked what Maple wished had happened. Maple was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the mother doll and made her stop the father doll before any of the kids got hurt. Cormac said that would have been good. He said in real life Mommy couldn't stop Daddy that night, and that's why Maple had to protect everyone. Maple's small voice said, "Mommy should have stopped Daddy a long time ago." I stood up fast and left the observation room. I couldn't watch anymore. Cormac found me in the hallway 5 minutes later. I was crying too hard to speak. He said what I'd just witnessed was Maple working through her trauma by trying to gain control over the narrative. He said she was trying to find a version of events where she didn't have to hurt anyone, but she kept coming back to the reality that she'd been forced into an impossible situation by the adults who should have protected her. He meant me. I was the adult who'd failed to protect her. Cormac said Maple would need ongoing therapy for a long time, but she was making progress. He said children were resilient, but they needed consistent safety and support to heal. He asked again if I was committed to providing that. I wiped my face and said yes. I would do whatever it took for as long as it took. 2 weeks later, Cormac called me back for another observation session. He said Maple had been working through something important, and he wanted me to see it. I drove to his office and sat in the small room with the one-way mirror, put on the headphones. Maple was already on the floor with her dolls in the dollhouse. She picked up the small girl doll and the man doll, made the man doll walk toward the girl doll with heavy stomping movements. The girl doll backed away. Then Maple stopped. She picked up the mother doll instead, made the mother doll step between the man doll and the girl doll. The mother doll pushed the man doll away. The girl doll didn't have to pick up the tiny plastic knife this time. Maple nodded to herself like this version was better. She reset the scene and tried it again the same way. Mother doll protecting girl doll. No knife needed. Cormac's voice came through the headphones, gentle and careful. He asked Maple if that's what she wished had happened. Maple nodded hard. Cormac said that would have been very good if it happened that way. He said in real life, Mommy couldn't stop Daddy that night. That's why Maple had to protect everyone. Maple's hands stopped moving the dolls. Her voice was so small I could barely hear it through the speakers. She said, Mommy should have stopped Daddy a long time ago, before anyone got hurt, before Maple had to use the knife. My chest felt like it was caving in. I stood up too fast, and the chair scraped loud against the floor, ripped the headphones off, left the observation room, made it to the hallway before the crying started. Couldn't stop it. Slid down the wall and sat on the floor with my hands over my face. Cormac found me there 5 minutes later, sat down next to me on the floor, didn't try to make me stop crying, just handed me tissues and waited. When I could finally breathe again, he said Maple was processing her trauma by trying to rewrite the story, trying to find a version where she didn't have to hurt anyone. But she kept coming back to the truth, that she'd been put in an impossible situation by the adults who were supposed to protect her. He meant me. I was the adult who failed. Cormac said Maple needed years of therapy, but she was making progress. Said kids can heal if they have consistent safety and support. Asked me again if I was committed to providing that. I wiped my face and said yes, whatever it took for as long as it took. Grace called the next morning, said she wanted to meet to discuss reunification planning. My hands shook so bad I almost dropped the phone. She scheduled it for that afternoon at the CPS office. I showed up 20 minutes early and sat in the waiting room watching the clock. Grace finally called me back to her office. She had a thick file on her desk with my name on it, pulled out papers and started going through them one by one. 6 weeks of therapy attendance, every single session, completion certificate from the Domestic Violence Education Program, proof of participation in 3 different support groups, my new apartment lease showing stable housing, letters from my therapist documenting my growing understanding of how I'd enabled the abuse. Grace looked up from the papers, said she was cautiously optimistic about starting supervised home visits. My throat closed up. I asked when. She said we needed to make a plan first, figure out the order and timeline, make sure everything was set up right. Grace pulled out a blank form and started writing. Said we'd begin with Sophie since her needs were most straightforward. Safety, stability, continued therapy for her trauma responses. Sophie would come home first for a trial period with intensive monitoring. Then Patrick once Sophie was settled. Finally Maple, whose case was more complicated because of the stabbing. Grace wrote down a timeline. 8 more weeks if everything went well. 8 weeks felt like forever, and also terrifyingly soon. She explained that each kid would have specific requirements, check-ins with CPS, therapy appointments I had to maintain, any sign of problems, and they'd pull the kids back to foster care immediately. I said I understood. Signed the reunification plan where she pointed. Took my copy with shaking hands. I spent the next week preparing Sophie's room, painted it her favorite color, light purple, set up her bed exactly where she liked it by the window, bought new sheets with stars on them, installed a lock on her door that only she could control from the inside. Grace had said that was important, giving Sophie control over her own space. I wrote out a safety plan on a piece of paper and put it on Sophie's nightstand. If she ever felt scared, she could lock her door, call me, call Grace, call 911. The numbers were all listed. I also wrote that she was safe now, and I would protect her. Grace came to inspect everything, walked through Sophie's room, checking each detail, tested the lock, read the safety plan, nodded slowly, said it looked good. Scheduled Sophie's first overnight visit for that Friday night, 3 days away. I asked if I was ready. Grace said we'd find out. Friday arrived too fast. Grace brought Sophie to the house at 4 in the afternoon. Sophie got out of the car carrying a small bag. Wouldn't look at me. Grace walked her inside and reviewed the rules. She'd be back tomorrow morning at 9. Any problems? Call immediately. Then Grace left, and it was just me and Sophie standing in the living room. I showed Sophie her room. She walked in slowly, touched the purple walls, sat on the bed, tested the lock 3 times, pushed her dresser against the door even though she had the lock. I made dinner, but she barely ate. At bedtime, she checked every lock in the house. Front door, back door, all the windows. Checked them again, then a 3rd time. Finally went to her room and locked the door. I heard the dresser scraping against the floor as she pushed it back in place. Lay in my own bed listening to every sound. Around midnight, I heard Sophie scream, ran to her door and knocked. She unlocked it after a minute. Her face was wet with tears. I asked if I could come in. She nodded. Sat with her until she fell back asleep. Happened again at 3 in the morning. Same thing. By the time Grace arrived at 9, Sophie looked exhausted, but she handed me a note before leaving. 3 words in her handwriting. I'm glad home. The next 2 weeks, Sophie came for overnight visits every Friday. Each time was a little easier. The lock checking went from 3 times to 2 times to once. The nightmares happened less. She still wouldn't speak, but she wrote me notes every day. About school, about her art therapy, about missing her brother and sister. Her therapist said this was big progress, that Sophie's voice would come back when she felt truly safe. I drove her to every therapy appointment, followed every single thing her therapist recommended, bought the special journal her therapist suggested, made sure Sophie had art supplies for expressing feelings. Grace watched all of it, taking notes, checking in constantly. After 2 weeks, she said Sophie could move home permanently. I cried when she said it. Sophie moved back in on a Saturday, unpacked her stuff slowly, tested her door lock, but didn't push the dresser against it this time. Phil called me 2 days later, said Patrick's return home was scheduled next, but Patrick was having doubts. Phil said Patrick told him he wasn't sure he wanted to come back, that he felt safer in foster care where he didn't have to protect anyone, where he could just be a kid. Phil and the family therapist were working with him, trying to help him understand his role wasn't protector anymore, that I was taking responsibility for everyone's safety now, but Patrick didn't trust that yet. Phil said it might take time, asked if I was patient enough to wait. I said I'd wait as long as Patrick needed. 3 weeks later, Patrick finally agreed to come home. Phil brought him over on a Sunday afternoon. Patrick walked in carrying 2 bags, looked around like he was inspecting everything, checked the locks on the front door, asked me when I'd change them. I said right after everything happened. He nodded, went to his room, came back out 10 minutes later and asked to see my therapy appointment card. I showed him. He looked at the dates, all the stamps from attending, put it back down without saying anything. At dinner, he asked about my support group meetings, when they were, how often I went. I answered every question. That night he checked all the locks himself before bed, just like Sophie used to. The next morning he asked if I'd really cut off contact with his father and the in-laws. I showed him the restraining order, the blocked numbers on my phone. He studied it all carefully. This became the pattern. Patrick testing me constantly, asking about therapy, checking locks, questioning my decisions. The family therapist said this was normal. Patrick needed to see consistent follow-through before he'd trust me. He was testing whether I could actually keep them safe, so I let him test. Showed him everything he asked to see. Maintained strict boundaries with no contact from my husband or his family. Went to every therapy session for me and the kids. Responded immediately anytime Sophie or Patrick had concerns. Kept communication open even when Patrick's questions felt like accusations. Week after week. Patrick slowly stopped checking the locks every night. Stopped asking to see proof of my therapy. Started talking to me about normal things like homework and his plans for college. The family therapist said he was learning to trust again. 2 months after Sophie came home, Eliza called. Said the prosecutor's office needed Maple evaluated before approving her return. They wanted to make sure she wasn't a danger to herself or others. I felt sick. Maple was 7 years old, and they were treating her like a criminal. Eliza said it was standard procedure in cases where a child committed violence, even defensive violence. Cormac would do the evaluation since he'd been working with Maple already. He'd submit his report to the court. I asked how long it would take. Eliza said a few weeks. Cormac called me the next day. Said he'd completed his assessment of Maple. Spent hours reviewing her case, her therapy progress, her behaviors in foster care. His conclusion was clear. Maple had acted in defense of her family with no indication of ongoing violent tendencies. She wasn't aggressive with other kids, didn't have anger problems. The stabbing was a single act of protection in an extreme situation. His report recommended reunification with continued intensive therapy. He'd submit it to the court and the prosecutor's office by the end of the week. 2 weeks later, I sat in Judge Layla Kent's courtroom while she reviewed the thick stack of case materials spread across her desk. She read through Cormac's evaluation, my therapy records, the home safety assessment, and reports from all 3 children's therapists. The courtroom felt too big and too quiet. Judge Kent looked up and removed her reading glasses. She approved Maple's return home effective immediately, but her next words made my stomach drop. Any indication of unsafe conditions would result in immediate removal of all 3 children. I was under court supervision for the next year, with monthly check-ins and surprise home visits. I nodded and thanked her, knowing I was lucky to get this chance at all. The alternative was losing them forever. The following Saturday morning, Maple came home carrying a small bag of belongings from her therapeutic foster placement. Sophie was waiting by the front door, and the second Maple walked in. Sophie grabbed her hand and pulled her upstairs to their shared bedroom. I followed slowly, my legs shaky, and watched from the doorway as Sophie showed Maple how she'd arranged all her favorite stuffed animals on the bed. Patrick appeared behind me and leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, but his expression was soft as he watched his sisters together. Maple climbed onto the bed and hugged each stuffed animal, then looked up at me with those big eyes. "Is Daddy coming back?" she asked. I knelt down next to the bed so we were at eye level. "No," I said. "Never." Maple's whole body relaxed, and she smiled for the first time since I'd seen her that morning. Sophie squeezed her hand, and Patrick uncrossed his arms. That evening, we had our first family dinner together in 10 weeks. I made spaghetti because it was easy, and all 3 kids liked it. Sophie still wouldn't speak, but she smiled at Maple across the table when Maple told a story about one of the other kids in her foster home. Patrick sat quietly and ate his food, glancing up occasionally to watch his sisters. Maple talked enough for everyone, chattering about her therapy sessions and the games they played and how her foster mom had a cat that slept on her bed. I watched them and felt this overwhelming mix of happiness and grief for all the time they'd lost. I promised myself silently that I would never fail them again, that every decision from now on would put their safety first. Sophie reached over and put her hand on top of mine for just a second before pulling back. 3 weeks later, Eliza called about the criminal case. My husband's attorney was pushing hard for a plea deal to avoid trial. He would plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a shorter sentence than the maximum. She explained the terms and asked how I felt about it. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and felt torn in half. Part of me wanted him to face a trial where everyone would hear what he did to our children, where Patrick could testify and the jury would see Sophie's drawings and know about Maple stabbing him in self-defense. But another part just wanted it over, so we could start healing without the trauma of a trial hanging over us. I needed to talk to the kids before deciding anything. That evening after dinner, I sat down with Patrick first and explained the plea deal option. He got angry immediately, his face flushing red. He wanted a trial because he wanted everyone to hear what his father had done, wanted it on public record. I listened and told him I understood. Then I went to Sophie's room where she was drawing at her desk. I explained it through simple terms, and she wrote me a note on her sketch paper. "I just want it over," the note said. "I don't want to see him ever again." I kissed the top of her head. Maple was harder to talk to because she was only 7 and didn't fully understand the legal system. I tried to explain in simple terms that Daddy might go to jail for less time if he admitted what he did wrong. She looked confused and asked if her stabbing Daddy meant he had to go to jail. I explained that Daddy was going to jail because of what he did to all of us, not because she protected us. After 2 days of thinking and one more conversation with Eliza, I agreed to the plea deal. My husband pleaded guilty to aggravated domestic violence and child endangerment. He got 5 years in prison with mandatory anger management and substance abuse treatment. It was less than the maximum sentence of 15 years, but more than I'd feared he might get with a good lawyer. Patrick was disappointed and didn't talk to me for 2 days after I told him. But when I sat him down and explained that protecting their emotional well-being was more important than maximum punishment, that I didn't want them traumatized by testifying in court, he finally nodded. He still wasn't happy, but he accepted my decision. Over the next months, we focused on healing and building our new normal. I got a full-time job at a medical billing company that offered benefits, including health insurance that covered our therapy costs. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and I could work from home 2 days a week. Patrick started talking about college plans, researching schools within an hour of home so he could stay close to his sisters. Sophie's therapy continued with art and writing, and slowly she started speaking again. First, just single words, then short sentences. One night, about 4 months after Maple came home, Sophie told Maple goodnight out loud instead of writing it. Maple's face lit up, and she hugged Sophie so hard they both fell over on the bed laughing. Maple's nightmares became less frequent, down to maybe once a week instead of every night. We weren't fixed, but we were safe and together and slowly getting better. 8 months after that terrible night, we were having breakfast together on a Saturday morning. Maple said something silly about her cereal looking like alien food, and we all started laughing. Patrick was on his laptop researching local colleges, determined to stay close, even though I'd told him he could go wherever he wanted. Sophie was talking more each day, full sentences now, and she'd just joined an art club at the school where she was making actual friends. Maple still asked hard questions about that night sometimes, questions I tried to answer honestly, but gently. But she was sleeping without her nightlight now, and hadn't asked if she was bad in weeks. I looked at my 3 children sitting around our kitchen table, scarred but surviving, healing but not healed, and knew that while I could never undo the years I failed them, I could spend every day forward keeping them safe. We weren't the family we were before, and we'd never be perfect, but we were together, and we were free, and that was enough for now. Thanks for being here till the end. I'm really glad we could share this story together. I hope it brought a little light to your day.